Are we good to go?
Yeah.
We're good to go. Let's go.
I don't know which glasses I'm going to use. I don't know what to see better with.
I can't see with my glasses.
I think we're live.
Yay. Okay.
Go for it, Martha.
Great. Well, welcome everyone to the first of our legal lunch and learn sessions because Martha likes alliteration. We are the Pacific Legal Education and Outreach Society, and our mission is to empower nonprofits and artists across the province with what they need to know to better manage legal issues and legal needs. And my role today will be to introduce Grant, introduce the program, and to moderate the question and answer phase of the discussion. Grant has gratefully will be providing us with a PowerPoint, and after the session we will also have some materials for you as follow-ups. For those of you in Vancouver, this is part of a project that the City of Vancouver Social Planning have funded, and we will be coming back to you with a survey on what your views are. So I'd really appreciate it if when you get it and you're based in Vancouver and you're a community or social service agency, that you are able to participate in the survey process. So first, I'd like to acknowledge we are on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, and we are grateful for their forbearance on our behalf. And I will now invite you to welcome Grant Haddock. Grant Haddock is a lawyer who practices, I guess, exclusively housing law. We've done a few things together in the past. He's an expert on many of these areas, and I'm really grateful for you today and your willingness to do this. So I'll turn it over to you, Grant.
Okay, thanks, Martha. It's extraordinary times bring extraordinary people together as we're trying to get through what's happening with the COVID issues and all of that. So what I'm going to do is take everyone through like a pretty short presentation here on commercial leasing. It is extraordinary times. I keep telling my daughters who are teenagers that you should remember this, or you will remember this for the rest of your life, because it's kind of the time that the earth stood still. And I've had an interesting conversation with the nonprofit housing provider on the coast, in the Sunshine Coast, and she was sort of lamenting about how things are, and how society is going, and how everything's been shut down, and the renters that she takes care of basically in that situation are having such terrible times. And I said, well, look at the world in the way it is today, is that if you look at COVID, yes, it's very serious, it's very dangerous, and many people are getting sick, but a very small percentage of people get very sick, and a very small percentage of those people die. But look at what the rest of humanity is willing to do, is to stop everything, including our economy, in order to protect the most vulnerable of our society. And I thought, well, if there's a good news story about COVID, it might be that, is that there is hope for humanity in the way we treat each other. So commercial leasing. So I do, as Martha says, we do an awful lot of housing law at Haddock & Company. Residential tenancies, probably no one does more Res 10 in the province than we do. And we've had a lot to do lately because of all the government announcements. Strata property law, a lot of nonprofit housing law. We do construction law, and we do commercial leasing. Not a ton of it, but enough of it to make us dangerous, is what I like to say. The province has invoked what's called the Emergency Programs Act, which no one's really talking a lot about, which is this incredibly powerful piece of legislation that allows the government to change acts or amend them by ministerial order, which means that the cabinet gets together, and the cabinet being the current governing party, NDP, and the cabinet ministers, and they make pass ministerial orders. And so in my world, especially with the residential tenancy, they did that with the Residential Tenancy Act. They made some really interesting amendments to the Residential Tenancy Act. But certain things, you know, like how many people can gather. You can't put 49 people together. Certain non-essential businesses have been ordered to shut down, you know, like hairdressers and nail places, things like that. And, you know, practically speaking, the public is not venturing out to comply with suggestions from Dr. Bonnie to stay home and apply physical distancing. And that is why we're all sitting here in my home office. Martha's at home and you're all at home, hopefully, listening to us and watching this, because that's what we do, because we're good citizens. So for impacts on nonprofits, so our audience, of course, is nonprofits. I work for, you know, plenty of for-profit tenants like restaurants and play areas and places like that. But for nonprofits, I think the first thing I posted about commercial leasing, I do a lot of Twitter work. One of the first things I posted was a nonprofit dance studio in Chilliwack who tends to, they provide, I think, learning for the disabled, I think for autistic, I think it was Down syndrome kids. They do the rhythmic gymnastics, which is really good for Down syndrome kids. And they were forced to leave. I mean, they had a good landlord, but the landlord was saying, well, I mean, you don't have any money. And so that particular nonprofit simply, I don't think, looked at their options, maybe didn't even think of their options. They just up and packed up their stuff and they left, and the landlord's now got an empty space, which he may or may not lease. And when things turn around, maybe this nonprofit will come back if that space is still empty. But many of your nonprofits are struggling with reduced or absolutely eliminated income. So if you're a restaurant who happens to be a nonprofit, your income's probably eliminated, although I've seen some coffee shops are staying open or trying to stay open. So what we're gonna look at today is what options you have as a nonprofit when the rent is due and you can't either afford to pay it or you can't flat out pay it at all. So the first issue is deferred rent. That's basically your main point of entry with your landlord, is to look at deferred rent, which is to maintain your relationship with your landlord. As you know, before COVID-19, if you've ever tried to get into the commercial market, it was extremely tight. And I guess today is extremely tight, extremely expensive. Nothing's available, nothing's cheap. And they're building, or were building, commercial space as much as they possibly could. I don't know what the world looks like after COVID-19. It might be the exact same because it's Vancouver. Vancouver seems to be somewhat insulated from these economic jolts. But first things, like, landlords don't like empty spaces. Empty space is not good. It doesn't generate any income. They still have to pay carrying costs and property taxes. Now, the other thing that isn't generally known about landlords is that sometimes landlords will like empty spaces, because landlords, when they're financing and getting money, they have to show the bank certain things. And if they can't show the bank a statement that shows that a tenant is making X amount, or they're earning X amount of money from a tenant, sometimes it's better to have an empty space rather than a lousy lease that doesn't pay enough. So that's why you'll see spaces like looking empty for like a long time. But why is that space still empty? It's because it's actually better to have an empty space than to show a bank a bad balance sheet with a long-term lease for 5 years. So yeah, they don't like empty spaces, but they also don't like nothing at all, period. So if you're going to do a deferred rent agreement, it can be as an addendum to your contract, to your lease. And then asking for deferred rent, by the way, is not a breach of your contract, but you have to be careful as to how you approach it, which is like, you can't go and say, I want a deferred rent agreement or I'm leaving, because that's called anticipatory breach of contract, which could get you in hot water. So your approach has to be measured to your landlord, which is, I just need some help right now, and I'd really like some help with the lease contract, but it should never be coupled with a threat of, or else I'll leave. So the pitfall of deferred rent, if you can arrange that, is a chance for a landlord to impose conditions. And it's natural to say, okay, well, if I'm going to give you something, I want something back. And so it's a two-way street. Landlords can ask for something in return. The one thing I want you to be careful about is the landlord looking for, the personal obligations which weren't there before, like saying, well, I'd like a personal guarantee on the rent. So in a nonprofit, that would be extremely rare. But if you're a business, those aren't so rare, because they're looking at limited liability companies that are the lessor or the lessees. And so they're saying, well, if the limited liability company doesn't have anything, I want to make sure I have something in the hopper to pay later. So they'll be looking for personal guarantees. That, like, as I said, be extremely rare to nonprofit, and something you would definitely want to stay away from as a nonprofit. It's just not worth carrying on the business if they're asking you for personal guarantees. So on the residential side, we worked closely with an organization called Landlord BC and to put together a deferred rental agreement. We have a long form, which I think is the great form, and we have a short form because everyone said the long form was way too legal and we couldn't figure it out. And I said, okay, well, whatever. I did a short form. The short form is easier. It's shorter. That's all I can say. And it may not be as ironclad if you're a landlord. So good news for you as tenants. Maybe it's not as ironclad as what I built for landlords previously. Martha's, I think, reworked that to make it work for a commercial setting. So that will be available to you either through Martha or through myself if you wish to get this rent deferral agreement if you haven't already got one in place. If you're ever presented with a rent deferral agreement, get legal advice, please. Have somebody look at it for you because you want to make sure that it works for you going forward and you're not getting yourself into some sort of mess. So don't consider this to be, and this isn't so much you guys, maybe for the residential tenancy thing, the residential tenants will consider themselves to be victims. And yes, we are victims of circumstance. Everybody is, but so is your landlord. So don't forget that he's probably got obligations to meet as well. He's got taxes. He might have, if he's a bigger operation, he's got employees. If he's got operating costs, maybe he's got a roof project in the works that he has to get done. So you're going to need to get together with your landlord and address these issues together. And because you got to look at each other's needs. And so get ready for this. Get ready to pay operating costs, and which means like his maintenance, ongoing monthly maintenance, like hydro, and his property taxes, even if he agrees to a rent deferral. So interesting story. Some properties, depending on what's going on there, is that your operating costs might be equal to or just slightly less than your actual rent, because and if your rent is cheap. So that, you got to keep that too. You got to figure out before you go into looking at renewing or doing a rent deferral, how much is the operating costs and what could happen if your landlord wants you to pay the operating costs as well. So this is interesting, the pandemic clause. If I'm acting for a landlord, this whole pandemic thing, which I suppose everyone thought might happen, but is actually happening, is going to be new provisions in at least my standard form of lease when I'm acting for landlords, is that there's going to be a pandemic clause. So if you're going to do any sort of rent deferral, there is likely going to be a clause in that rent deferral that will carve out pandemics from what's called the force majeure clause. And I'll get into what force majeure is in just a second. Because I think the general thought out there is there's a risk that even if we flatten the curve here in BC, which I think we're doing, thank God, but if we, even if we flatten the curve and it goes down and we are successful in decreasing our rate of infection, there is a chance that rate might pop up again because as the world starts to travel again, as people don't get as cautious, the pandemic will pop up again. And this is going to happen time and time again until we get our vaccine to help us battle this virus. And that vaccine is probably a year away, maybe less if we're extremely lucky, and then seeing some really interesting work coming out of UBC of all places. It seems like we're the forefront in Canada. But that's the good news story. We won't have to worry about it. But as a landlord and as a lawyer, I'm looking at, well, there's a realistic chance that the pandemic might pop up again in the fall, even if we beat it this summer. So those pandemic clauses are going to show up in your renewals. The other thing I've been asked about lately is force majeure, and what does that mean? Because some of them, my clients are saying, well, do I have to do anything at all? I mean, do I have to do a rent reduction or rent deferral agreement? Why can't I just say it's not possible for me to do it at all and invoke the force majeure clause, which is often, but not always, in your commercial leases? So you got to look, because it's not always there, and it's written in many different ways. So force majeure clauses are generally included in contracts, and they account for circumstances where a party cannot perform the contract due to circumstances beyond its control. These are called like acts of God, and sometimes you'll see those words in there, acts of God clauses. But these would not rise to the level of satisfying the doctrine of frustration. So back up a little, if you don't actually have a force majeure clause, you might be able to rely on what's called the common law doctrine of frustration, which is you can't perform the contract. So assuming COVID-19 is force majeure within the meaning of the contract, the party claiming, which would be you, the benefit of the clause must show that you cannot perform your contractual obligations due to unforeseeable extraordinary circumstances beyond your control. So say, for instance, you operate a nonprofit nail bar. There is there's a directive from the government out there that you shall not operate your nonprofit nail bar. So because of circumstances beyond your control, you've now been forced to shut down and cannot operate. That's a pretty good force majeure example for force majeure clause. So like given the current state of affairs, it's likely, I think, likely that a court would find that force majeure is an unforeseeable event outside the control of either party. I don't know. You can't take that to the bank, that's for sure, because I'm on a webinar and I haven't seen your contract. So if you want to know for sure if you're force majeure and given COVID-19 is a good way out of your contract, then get the advice from a lawyer. So whether COVID-19 makes it impossible for a party to fulfill your contractual obligations is a different matter. It's all fact-driven. Depends on what you do for a business. What can you do to mitigate the situation? The obligations cannot simply be more difficult to fulfill. They must be impossible. So for instance, right now, my law firm, it's not difficult to fulfill our obligations because my law firm was built around remote work and work from home. So for us, it's business as usual. Is it more difficult? Yeah, it is. I can't take your documents at our office door anymore because it's closed. But it's not impossible because many lawyers are working from home and we're all doing this. We're doing Zoom, talking to our clients. So no, I could not go to my landlord and say it's impossible to work, because it's not for me. So each matter will turn on the facts. So you've got to have someone look at the facts for you, most likely a lawyer or a trusted advisor who will help you get through understanding what the facts are. And you also should watch out that these force majeure clauses may require mitigation, which means you have to do your best to make sure that your business can still operate and that you're not completely handcuffed by what's happening with COVID-19. So the last thing in my major thing here is that there's no legal remedies right now because the courts are closed. The Supreme Court shut down back in late March. They thought they actually had an opening date, I think, in May. That's been changed now to indefinitely. If you read the tea leaves and the documents I've seen and what they're doing at the registry, it looks to me that their target date to reopen is May 4th, 2020. But you don't have any level of court right now, like nothing is open. There's like provincial court is closed, Supreme Court is closed, the Court of Appeal is closed. You can do filings, you can do electronic filings, but nobody's going to get in front of a judge or no one's going to get a writ of possession either in front of a judge unless it's an emergency, and commercial tenancy issues are not classified as emergencies right now. Residential tenancy matters are, if you want to get a stay on a writ, but commercial tenancy ones aren't. So if your landlord threatens you and says, well, I'm going to court, well, he is not going to court. He might be able to file something, but that's it. RTB is still operating as normal. The Civil Resolution Tribunal is operating as normal because those are all online matters. And the HRT, Human Rights Tribunal, is operating as well, but not having any hearings. So that's the state of what's happening in the court system right now. So questions, I have to go over to Martha again. Great.
Well, thanks for giving us a pretty simple overview of the current situation. So one of the, I think one of the hopes that many people have is the possibility of rent abatement. And, in my experience, there's not really very much room in leases for rent abatement. Have you seen any situations? What would be the situations where an abatement is it might occur?
I think every situation is some where it might occur. You have to ask to be to find out if the door is absolutely closed. I think that if you can show your landlord that I need 3 or 4 months off my lease from payments, and then you can build a scenario that says, look, and I'll pay an extra $500 over what I normally have to pay for rent for the next 8 or 9 months. Then I think you're going to get some traction with your landlord, because I think nobody knows what's going to look like in 4 months' time as far as the economy goes. I'm a glass half full guy, and I think that, at least in British Columbia, there's going to be pent up demand. There's going to be once everyone's allowed to come out of their caves, they're going to hit the streets, and they're going to be I think for the majority of people in this province are going to be spending. There's a lot of people who are going to have trouble because of job loss and all that. They're just never going to get that money back that they are going to lose for the next 4 months. So they're not going to be part of the equation. But I think everybody else who's working, who's able to carry on, who's able to weather the storm, is going to have pent up demand, and they're going to be out in droves. And so every restaurant that's able to have survived this thing is going to be overflowing as of when people are back out again. And by the way, this is anecdotal again as to what is actually happening in the economy. I've seen many stories of restaurants in my neighborhood, which is North Vancouver, saying, "Oh gosh, we need help! Please buy local," and all that stuff. So on Friday and Saturday, my wife and I tried to do skip the dishes and DoorDash, completely full, jammed, overflowing. Restaurants can't handle the orders. It's not so. People are responding to this. They are doing that, and so I think as a business owner and a nonprofit, if you have something that people valued before, they're going to value it again. And so
right.
that's the story.
And I think in my experience, I know there's often reticence around approaching your landlord about what your needs are. Offer something. By offering something in the context of a rent abatement or deferral, you're showing that you recognize that no matter how large the landlord is, that they are also affected by this. And it can give you, it can take you a little bit further in getting something closer to what you might want or what you might need. The other issue that I have noticed is insurance. Now, again, I haven't looked at a lot of business insurance policies recently, and I don't think I can recall one that actually included disruption of the business in there. Is it a standard provision in general liability insurance policies?
Yes, I have it. I have it in mine. So
Right.
in case.
And how does that work in a situation where there's a pandemic?
Well, you'd have to look at your insurance carefully. My thing is, like, I have clients who come to me, can you examine my insurance policy to see if I have a claim? And I go, no, just do it. Claim it. It's the broker will figure it out for you. Don't waste your money on a lawyer telling you whether you have a claim. Wait till they deny, then go to your lawyer about it. So my advice is, oh yeah, sure, go to your insurer. It doesn't cost you anything. And I am consistently surprised by what insurers will pick up on these things. So do it. Make a claim.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really, really important information for a lot of people. A lot of small nonprofits, particularly ones that we see a lot, they actually have never looked at their policy and are, again, reticent about asking for what they need. And I'm one of those people that is like, always say, do it and see what happens, rather than this very sort of non-confrontational approach, which is wait for somebody to come along and offer you a rent subsidy. I mean, in a perfect world, the government might bring in some kind of rent subsidy. I doubt it for a lot of different reasons, but primarily I don't think it will play politically. That being said, it depends on how long this goes on for. So I'm going to move to some of the questions that were in the registration forms. Ah, so one person asks, it would be nice to find out how to recognize when a deal is good or bad.
Well, the deal's good when everyone's unhappy. That's a good deal. Because if one side's too happy, that's not a good deal. Something's going wrong. So that's
I would never have put it that way, but it's absolutely right. Yeah. So the other, and this may be beyond the scope of today's discussion, is CMHC has a big role in certain areas like Granville Island. They tend, in my experience, to be somewhat less nimble, less able to negotiate quickly, certainly quickly. They move very slowly. Have you had any experiences dealing with CMHC leases that might help folks that are currently really stuck on Granville Island in a multitude of ways?
it's funny to say the only experience I've had lately with CMHC is on Granville Island for a client there. Not a good situation. I mean, Granville Island's got its own set of issues, which is mostly dangerous buildings that people are sitting in that are going to kill them, which CMHC is desperately trying to, renovate, and by moving people around and kicking them out or offering them deals. Anyway, I found them well, CMHC is a business, right? They're not really they don't seem to be willing to help people anymore like they used to, but they're a business, they're a bank, so I found them to be business-like, and also, even on Granville Island, I found them to be generous. So even though it didn't seem that way to my client, but I found them to be at least willing to be flexible with moving people around and stuff. And they don't want Granville Island empty either. And even though there seems to be maybe some chatter down there among the artists that it's super expensive and all they want is a ton of money. Well, that could have happened years ago and hasn't, and they keep renewing leases. So I suspect in that venue are interested in keeping the people who are down there, not interested in kicking them out or having them go. So for CMHC, well, it is a bureaucracy. They move slow. I'm dealing with certain things with them right now, mostly dealing with financings. It's business as usual. They appear to be operating remotely, just like everyone else is.
Right.
Nothing's a slowdown. So, it depends on where you are. They might have a policy statement with your particular location. Certainly Granville Island does, or for what you're doing. And so that might help you.
Yeah. And I would add to that perhaps if there are other nonprofits operating, they're probably all facing similar situations. I can think of, the Fringe, the Writers Fest. Perhaps if you're the ones that are being affected, and I don't know that that's the case, but to work together and to approach CMHC as a group so that everybody benefits equally. Some of the organizations on Granville Island are bigger than others. And I think this is particularly risky right now for the organizations that are the performing arts organizations that are on the island, because obviously their revenues are zero, and they must be very concerned about the long term. So I would encourage those folks perhaps to get together, and also, were it possible to get together, perhaps together they could retain counsel to work with CMHC. I've found that in my experience with nonprofits on the island that it's time consuming but not impossible, notwithstanding the limitations of some of the leases. So someone asking about the slides. Yes, they'll be made available. And so This is a very specific question. What mechanism can a triple net lease renter make use of? Pursue the savings of the 50% reduction in school tax as outlined by the BC provincial government.
Yeah, that's one of the items that's out there that you can take advantage of. There's you're going to get a break as a tenant on 50% of the value of the school tax of whatever you're paying on a triple net lease. I should add right now that like my inbox is crammed with chit chat from industry people about what's going on and what's happening with the resource and all of that. And one of the best websites I've found for information for where you can get money is Bronwyn Ma, who's actually my local MLA in North Vancouver. She's got a great spot on the website, which is constantly updating all of the places where you might get money to assist you, either personally or business-wise or nonprofits or whatever. And everything's linked, so just click on it and boom, you're at the application stage. So that's a great resource.
That's great. We'll make sure to put that up on our website, and also when we do reach out to folks after this, we'll send that link as well. So in other words, when you're in the triple net lease situation, you could get an agreement on the rent deferral. You'd still be on the hook for the taxes, but there would be a reduction in those taxes as a consequence of the measures that the government has taken.
Yeah, so well, if you do a rent deferral, I mean, your first line of attack would be, I want like a total deferral, like all cost. I want my triple net and my rent deferred. And then I said, well, be prepared for the landlord to push back on that and say, well, I got costs that ain't going away. I mean, I need your rent, but I got these other things that I want to get dealt with. So if you're at that, if you're paying the triple net, well, eventually you'll probably get to, I mean, the landlord can't, as I understand it, the landlord can't get that benefit of the lower tax unless, I think it's going to be actually the tenant's going to apply for it. So you'll get that. But the landlords might not be, it might be a bit of a bonus if the landlord doesn't figure it out, because they might not know that, and you might get a little extra money because you'll pay a little less tax on triple net going forward. But if you're not paying anything, the landlord defers everything, then you're gonna have to be alive to trying to get that triple net benefit or that school tax benefit. You have to remember to apply for it. And then I'm just wondering if you can, because if you're not paying any rent anyway or paying no triple net during that time, you'll have to try to, I'm not sure how you explain that in your application that it's just deferred.
Right. Well, that might be one of those issues that we highlight collectively to government to say, this is an impact that we need to have explained on the government websites.
Right.
Which is what happens in the event of a deferral.
Yeah. Well, the government has not come out with any sort of policy statement on rent deferral in residential tenancies, even though they're, anecdotally, I'm hearing reports from Victoria that 1/3 of residential tenants didn't pay their rent. And then Business in Vancouver reported in Vancouver it's 50%. And then I think someone else like News 1130 did a poll and it was way less than that. It was more like 20% in Vancouver. But the government hasn't come down with anything official saying you can defer your rent. And so we, as an industry, we've been working on that ourselves. It's something we've developed. And I don't think you're going to get any help with deferrals from the government. Yeah. It's just too thorny.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think there's going to be mass evictions when this is over?
In the residential?
Yeah.
No. What I think is going to happen is that people will have, figured out what they'll pay their rent eventually. Like you'll have landlords, either people are paying their rent right now from savings. If you can't, they'll probably, the majority of people can't, will get a break, and then they'll have to pay for it in the future, and they'll probably do it on a schedule. But I am now hearing stories of guys. I got a guy call me yesterday, who he has a basement suite, and he's living up there with his family. The guy downstairs has been evicted. He's got a order for possession, and the guy won't leave. And he's not working because he has a headache, not because he can't, but he's not working, and he won't go. So the guy can't get an order of possession, and he has another family coming in on April the 1st in that same space. So my guy is now having to vacate his upper level and put this family in there. So those are the steps that landlords are taking right now. So going forward, there's going to be 15% of people who are not paying rent simply because they don't want to. And in 4 months' time, when everything gets back to normal, or less, or 3 months' time, they'll simply leave and have saved $2,000, $6,000, which they'll go spend it somewhere else as a damage deposit somewhere else or whatever. Because there'll be those people will leave. They'll say, I just saved $6,000. Bye-bye, landlord. It's not my problem. And then they'll go. And so I don't think the evictions will happen. I think people will just have taken advantage of this and just leave.
Right. So another question that we have is whether we foresee that some of the same measures that were made available to residential tenants, such as orders to prevent evictions, would be extended to commercial tenants.
I don't believe so. There's just too much diversity in commercial tenants. I mean, you're talking everyone from Walmart to East End Food Co-op. So tenants are easier to deal with because they're a class that's easier, like a more definable class of commercial. Plus, I don't think helping commercial enterprise is politically expedient. A lot of people say, well, business is business, right? Why should I be subsidizing business? They don't want to do that. And they're not. Now, you might find like a program from maybe CMHC. That's my hope, is that CMHC might step in specifically for nonprofits. So that I don't think we'll see for any hope from either the provincial government. Certainly not provincial government. I don't anticipate that.
Right, but more than likely, if CMHC were to step in, it would be for those folks with whom they already are working. It wouldn't necessarily be across the board.
Maybe not. I mean, they might also be working with certain people, but they might. It depends. Like if you're classified in a certain area, I mean, they might not be working with a nonprofit daycare, but nonprofit daycares might need help. I don't think, like say for instance, East End Food Co-op. I don't know if they have a relationship with CMHC. Probably not. They might need help. Mountain Equipment Co-op? No, probably not. They probably don't need help. But so I don't know.
Yeah, I guess this is the point at which, the planning for contingencies is really important. And for a nonprofit, it probably is incumbent on nonprofits anyway to take this opportunity to raise with funders that sometimes the 10% that's allocated to administration is insignificant. Sort of the 10% rule, that it's not enough. It doesn't allow for these kinds of situations when they actually need additional resources, perhaps to get legal advice and also to negotiate rent deferrals or other kinds of agreements that become very time consuming and resource consuming for those nonprofits. And they're really not, they get the funding to offer their programs, not to address the nuts and bolts of how to manage in a pandemic. So I think there's a role there for nonprofit advocacy to really remind funders that these situations are happening now. We're in this pandemic, and there may well be others in the future that are not dissimilar that we need to take account of, whether it's fires in fire-prone areas or floods. It's going to be an issue that we really need the funders to be aware of the costs to a nonprofit, both hard and soft, when they haven't got the capacity to put aside contingency funds in the way that they would really need to in order to protect themselves. So one person did have a question about the insurance policy that we were talking about. before we started the Q&A. And that question, I think, is is around the business interruption. And what we're talking about there is a general liability insurance that all nonprofits should have taken out once they started operations, if possible. So
Yeah, I think, yeah, business, I don't know, I don't know for sure if business interruption is something that just comes with the policy. I mean, certain things just come with the policy, you can't take them out.
Right.
Business interruption might have been something that you would choose as a checkbox depending on who your broker is. So
Right.
I don't think it's not always there.
Yeah, and it may have never occurred to many nonprofits, if they have general liability, that their business would ever be disrupted. I think while there are some nonprofits that are fully operational, there are many, many, many arts organizations that are basically ceasing their operation completely, like Bard on the Beach announced this week. And, you know, they do have some year-round activities, but for some of the festivals that are summer festivals, they're hooped. And so they may not, in fact, have business disruption insurance. I would hope that the larger ones would, just as a matter of course, because of them being larger and perhaps more risk. But I think for a lot of small organizations, that is unlikely. So that is why you'd be advised to pull out your insurance and have a look at it and talk to your broker. And if it is available to you, make a claim. So here's another question from our listeners. We're a housing co-op with a nonprofit commercial tenant in our building. If we were to offer them some form of rent relief, could that qualify as a donation for tax purposes?
No.
No.
No, no.
No, and if you're a registered charity, and this is one of the things that you're thinking about, these are circumstances where you need to seek legal advice. Now is not the time to be playing fast and loose with your charitable status or entering into any kinds of arrangements that, were you to be audited, would be seen by the CRA as problematic, shall we say. Next week, we are going to be having a discussion with Anders Oram. Myself and Anders have put together a short info sheet on how to create a relief fund and the limitations on charities that want to deliver pandemic-related services or funds to non-qualified donees. So I would recommend perhaps you might want to join us next Wednesday. So another question, do commercial landlords require a writ of possession to seize tenant property? Oh, what?
No, they can,
Property.
well, there's this thing called Rent Distress Act, which is this unbelievably archaic, nearly as archaic as the Commercial Tenancy Act, but they can do what's called distrain, which means without getting a writ of possession, they can enter into the commercial unit and with a bailiff, and the bailiff basically stickers everything in there that looks like it's movable, that belongs to you. And that's called rent distress. And that puts anyone on notice that everything in there is not moved out. It's basically subject to seizure by the landlord, who can, then sell it to try to get rent back.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so then you would be in a situation where you would probably want to challenge that in court when the courts reopen?
Well, if you haven't paid your rent, this is why you want to have a conversation with your landlord, because there is the every good commercial lease I have seen has got like something called rent distress, like it's on a heading, it says rent distress right there. What they can do if they in fact want to come in and it's called distrain against your goods and stuff in there. So that's at risk. And you don't want, usually you get a notification in writing before this happens, so you know it's going to happen, so you can get in front of it. But that is, they don't need a writ of possession for that, but you can continue to operate. I've seen people operating with like stickers all over their stuff, but it's more for, I've never seen it used in like, say, like, I've only seen it used in a retail situation, because retail has got stuff they can sell and they want to grab all the retail stuff they can get. Which is also subject to whatever financing might be behind it. But yeah, they don't need a writ to come in and enter.
Right. Though, it would be incredibly, I mean, I could imagine a circumstance in the nonprofit space if the landlord took issue with the activities that the tenant was undertaking. For example, where a landlord were to decide that while they were okay with the safe injection site, they're not okay with the provision of a safe supply of drugs onto their premises, because it could affect their insurance on the building. That's one of the things that that the federal government apparently has now enabled in the city of Vancouver, or they're still arguing for it, which is the option to be able to provide a safe supply of drugs to people, so that they will stay in housing, self-isolate, and remain healthy. That, though, would put them conceivably, if this was a nonprofit offering to do this for these folks, then I could see that being an issue for some landlords who don't allow drug dealing or provision of drugs, even legal ones.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, they're still illegal. It's just the ability of healthcare professionals to provide the medication. So I don't know. I can foresee situations where landlords would do it, but it would be extremely unusual, I think, in the nonprofit space, given that many of the landlords are landlords that are in the business of some kind of social purpose themselves, like churches that own property, or redeveloped property owned by, like, Illuminative Housing, for example, and they've got a lot of tenants in their buildings that are commercial entities. So don't want to think too far about how bad this could get.
Yeah.
What happens when you close down your nonprofit and your lease requires you to be open? Does that enable a landlord to, would that enable the nonprofit to use the force majeure to say because it's impossible for them to provide services because of the province's actions or the city's actions, that they then, that's not a breach of their lease?
Yeah, I think that's your first line of attack. If you're forced, I would first tell your landlord and say, look, this is what's going to happen. Then you look at your lease to see if there's a force majeure clause in there. And then, of course, if it's not there, then you're looking at common law frustration. You'd have to see how, because you're not using force majeure to say you want out of your lease, because that's often what people do. That's what force majeure is kind of about, right? It's like, I want to get out of my lease, but people don't really want to get out of their leases. They just don't want to deal with the obligations for 4 months. Then let's giddy up again in August or whatever it is. But so you got to be careful how you use these remedies.
Yeah, and I think probably what you would want in that instance, it would be an amendment to the lease to permit you to for temporary that, or an acknowledgement in writing from your landlord that the temporary closure is not contrary to the terms, is not going to qualify as a breach of the lease.
Yeah, so I've seen at least from one landlord who's got a number of they're a bit philanthropic, but they've got a few properties in the downtown east side or close Gastown area, and they've sent out a memo to their tenants, understanding that a lot of them can't continue to operate, and also suggesting that they'd be okay if they put up hoarding on the door, on the storefronts. That means boards. Hoarding is the construction term for boarding things up, which is really ugly and looks a bit like a riot's been through there, but they're okay with that. And they're actually suggesting this might be a good idea, especially for insurance purposes, if you're ground level and you're in a neighborhood that suddenly doesn't have anybody there any longer. Because it's just, there's another thing we haven't talked about yet is I've hearing reports of like increased break-ins because
Right.
everyone's at home or
Right.
they're sequestered inside and the streets are empty. So you got to consider that too. If you're not operating, think about and notify your insurer too that you're not operating, because that changes risk. They might normally they say, well, thank you, we'll just put that on the file. Once in a while they'll say, can you pay us an extra $20 a month because your risk is higher, or that could happen. But for sure, if you're not operating, let your insurer know, and your landlord might be interested in boarding your place up depending on where you're located.
Right. So we have a follow-up on the reduction of the school tax question, which is that they had heard back from their local MLA that the landlord is not obligated to pass on that saving.
That's an outrage. Well, that might be true. I don't really know. Like every day something new comes down, like literally every day something new comes down. So I don't know exactly how the school tax is going to work.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm personally interested because I'm a tenant too, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, I think one of the difficulties that we are all facing in this moment is that we have to open up really difficult conversations with our landlords and or vice versa, our tenants, around what to do in this situation. And we have to, as you said, be open to not everybody being happy at the end of the day. It is going to be a compromise situation. Certainly, it would be helpful if landlords were taking their obligations seriously, and if they are getting an opportunity to reduce some of their costs, like through the school tax reduction, that it'd be strongly encouraged. Unfortunately, strong encouragement doesn't change the fact that some people are just not going, they're going to try to take advantage of the situation. And that works both ways. I think I'm going to thank you now, Grant. We've covered a whole range of questions, and we are going to put out an info sheet. It'll be out by next week and sent to all of the registrants, and it will also be made available on our website. And for any nonprofits that do have questions, we cannot provide legal advice, but we can provide legal information through our law students at lawfornonprofits.ca. I would encourage you also to avail yourself of the service, because it's one way, even if we can't help you, for helping us to be involved in advocacy efforts on the issue of the relief fund. I will be speaking to the CRA Charities Directorate next week, specifically about guidance to folks about that issue, and any issues that are coming up we want to be made aware of, so we can advocate along with Imagine Canada, Center for Policy Alternatives, and others, to ensure that the needs of nonprofits, and indeed the needs of our communities, are taken account of as we navigate these very troubled waters. So thank you so much, Grant, for giving us time today, and to our close to 60 registrants for participating. We will try to follow up with the individual questions, so don't despair. As well, you'll have the PowerPoint as well as the info sheet. And thanks to everyone for coming today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Great. Bye, everybody.
Bye.